She didn't clean the cabin first, and Ezra Madden didn't know why. He had hired her through a church in Denver to scrub his floors and chase the dust from a place he barely lived in anymore. Instead, she walked straight to the dead orchard, knelt in dirt that 3 years of drought had turned to powder, and told him the soil wasn't dead, only starved. Then she started feeding it with the things every rancher in the territory threw away: kitchen scraps, and cow manure, and the ash from his own stove. She grew something on ground that hadn't given a green leaf since before the bank started counting his debt. 1. Stay until the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways of Japan brought a dead valley back without raising her voice, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. Ezra Madden stood at the fence line and counted dead trees the way a man counts years off a sentence. 40 of them, planted the year his father broke ground on the Mule Creek Ranch, and 40 black sticks now scratching at a sky that had forgotten how to rain on Saltwash. The spring grass had come back green across the lower pasture, because grass is patient and grass is cheap. But the orchard had quit on him the season. The creek ran dry, and it hadn't changed its mind since. 3 years was how long the drought had held the valley by the throat, and how long Ezra had held the ranch by the same grip, knuckle white, refusing to be the Madden who lost the place. His father had ridden out of Tennessee with nothing but a warrant and a notion, and had put these 40 trees in the ground like a promise that the family would stop running. Ezra had spent his whole life keeping that promise, and now the promise was a row of charcoal stubs and a lone officer in Sage Creek who'd stop saying please. He worked sunup to sundown because there was nothing else to do with the fear. Up before light to check the upper spring, the one trickle still falling, then the fence lines, then the few head he'd left on the recovering grass. By dark he was too tired to eat and too proud to sit in a cabin that was falling apart around him, so mostly he sat on the porch and watched the dark come down over the orchard and didn't light a lamp. The cabin had a leaking back wall and a stovepipe that had come loose and a floor that hadn't been swept in longer than he could say, and he'd stopped seeing it the way a body stops noticing a scar once it heals. The notice had been his one concession. A church society in Denver ran a placement for ranchmen who needed a housekeeper, widows mostly, women who needed a roof and a wage, and didn't ask many questions. He'd written the letter in a hand he hated, asking for someone to keep the cabin standing and cook a meal at night, nothing more, and he'd mailed it like a confession. He didn't want company, he wanted someone to stop the house from rotting while he saved the land, or while he lost it, whichever came first, and he didn't much care which. The thing he wouldn't admit, standing there counting dead trees, was that he'd begun to think the moving men had it right. Out along the Territory Road, a family passed every few weeks, wagon loaded, riding out from dead ground toward ground they hadn't yet ruined, and Ezra watched them go with something close to envy. The frontier creed was simple, that when the land dies, a man rides out to find land that hasn't. His father had broken that creed once by staying and planting, and Ezra had spent 40 years trying to prove the old man right, and lately the proof was getting hard to come by. 60 days was what Hollis at the bank had given him in writing, on paper that smelled of ink and finality. 60 days to bring the loan current or sign the deed over and walk off the place his father had named. The grass was back, but grass wouldn't cover a banknote, and the orchard that might have paid the debt was a graveyard of sticks. Ezra spat into the dust and turned for the house, because the stage from Denver came in tomorrow and he'd given his word to meet it, and a man who can't keep his land can at least keep his word. Ezra was waiting at the Sage Creek stage stop when the dust showed on the southern road, and he was already sorry he'd come. The platform was little more than packed dirt and warped lumber with a roof that leaked and 3 men from town had gathered the way. Men gather when something unusual is expected, leaning on the rail with their hats low and their opinions ready. He told no one who the placement was sending, but the church letter had carried a name that didn't belong to any woman these men had ever met. And Sage Creek had a way of knowing a man's business before he did. The stage lurched to a halt in a cloud of dust so thick he could taste the grit between his teeth, and the driver didn't bother to set the step. The woman who climbed down was small-framed and thin in a way that spoke of long hunger rather than delicacy. Her hair pulled back tight under a dust-coated trail coat that hung past her knees. Beneath the coat, when it shifted, he caught the dull red of a kimono worn as an underlayer silk that had no business on a frontier platform and knew it. Her face was all sharp angles and high bones, eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the hat she held against the wind. And she didn't say anything to anyone. She just stood and waited. That was the first thing he noticed, that she waited. He'd expected fear or the pleading politeness of a woman who knows she's been sent somewhere she isn't wanted, and he'd braced himself for the awkward work of refusing to comfort her. She offered none of it. She looked at the platform the way a man reads weather before a long ride, measuring what was coming and deciding what to do about it, and her face gave away nothing about whether the answer pleased her. The kind of calm, he'd think later, that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome and found it survivable. The driver dropped her bundle at her feet without a word, and didn't offer to carry it, and not one of the men on the rail moved to help. She didn't ask them to. She picked up the cloth bundle herself, and then the lacquered box, a thing the size of a boot box, black with worn gold along the edges. She held it against her ribs the way a rancher holds good tack, like it was the one piece of equipment she wouldn't let the trail take. Ezra watched her hold it and felt something turn over in him that he couldn't have named, because people don't carry boxes that way unless the box is holding what's left of them. "You Madden?" the driver asked her, jerking a thumb toward Ezra without looking at him. She looked at Ezra, then direct, and he saw that her boots were a full size too large for her feet, a borrowed pair that had belonged to someone bigger and someone gone. "I am Sachi Watanabe," she said, and her voice was lower than he expected and steadier, each word placed like a stone in a wall. Then she picked up her things and walked toward his wagon, as if she'd already decided he'd take her, which left him standing there with the 3 men on the rail, watching and nothing at all to say. He almost sent her back. The words were right there, easy and cruel, that he'd asked for someone who could work a frontier kitchen and not a foreign woman half his age who'd give the town a reason to talk. But the stage was already hissing and lurching away down the road, and the driver wasn't coming back today, and Ezra Madden had given his word in a letter to a church, and a man who's losing his land can at least keep his word. He picked up the box without asking, surprised by how light it was, for how carefully she carried it. He set it in the bed of the wagon and told her to climb up. The whole ride back to the ranch, neither of them said a word, and the silence did all the talking. The first 3 days, she cleaned the cabin, the way a good hand fixes a saddle, thorough and without wasted motion, and Ezra stayed out of her way because the work embarrassed him. She mended the back wall with scraps of lumber and mud, reset the stovepipe, swept a floor that had gone black with boot oil and time, and by the 3rd evening the place smelled like wood soap instead of loneliness. He came in at dark to find a meal on the stove and the table wiped clean, and he ate it standing up, because sitting down to a kept house felt like admitting he'd needed one. But her eyes weren't on the cabin. He caught her at the window more than once, looking past the yard to the orchard, and the 3rd morning he found her out there before the sun was fully up, walking the rows of dead trees in the cold. She knelt at the 3rd tree and dug her fingers into the dirt, rubbed it between her hands, brought it to her nose, and then, before he could stop her, she put a pinch of it on her tongue. He said something sharp about poison and alkali, and she wiped her hands on her coat and looked up at him with no offense taken at all. "The soil is not dead," she said, as if she were telling him the time. "It is starved." Ezra laughed the hard kind that comes out before a man can stop it, because the idea was so far from anything the territory believed that it sounded like madness. Every rancher in Salt Wash knew the rule that a man ran cattle on grass until the grass gave out, and then he moved the herd to grass that hadn't, because the ground here was alkaline and thin, and it didn't pay to love it. He'd watched 3 years of drought turn his orchard to kindling, and he didn't need a woman from a church in Denver to tell him the difference between dead ground and ground that was merely hungry. He told her she'd been hired to clean the cabin, not to farm his dead orchard, and he turned and walked back to the fence line before she could answer. She didn't argue, and she didn't stop. The next morning he found her behind the cook shed building a heap, a low square of stacked stones she'd carried from the creek bed, and into it she was putting things that made his skin crawl with how carefully she handled them. Kitchen scraps from the meal she'd cooked, cow manure from the corral, a pile of fallen leaves she'd raked from under the cottonwoods, and the wood ash he'd been sweeping out of his stove and dumping at the edge of the yard for years. She sorted the ash with her bare hands, mixing it through the heap the way a woman folds flour into batter, and she didn't explain a single thing she was doing, which made him watch her all the closer. He'd thrown away every one of those things 1,000 times, the scraps and the manure and the ash, and he'd never once thought of any of them as worth keeping. She handled them the way he handled seed corn in a lean year, like every handful was a decision about next spring, and the longer he watched, the more the wrongness of it sat in his chest. The detail that shouldn't have been there wasn't the heap itself, it was the care. The way she treated waste as something a man would be a fool to lose. She caught him watching from the fence on the 4th afternoon and didn't look away. "The ground here throws everything away," she said, quiet and plain. "Where I come from, nothing leaves the farm. Everything goes back." Then she turned back to her heap and left him standing there with a sentence that didn't make sense to him yet and wouldn't leave him alone until it did. Through the back half of spring she planted the orchard like she was writing something in the dirt, and Ezra let her because stopping her would have meant standing in front of her and meaning it, and he found he didn't mean it. She sowed daikon radish in long drills along the hardpan rows, a white root he'd never seen, and when he asked, she told him the root went down deep and broke the packed ground open so the water and the air could get back in. At the base of each dead fruit tree she set beans, pressing them into the dirt with her thumb, and she told him the beans took nitrogen from the air and put it back into the soil to feed the tree above them. Between the rows she tucked marigolds and the small onions she'd carried in her lacquered box, and she said the smell of them turned the insects off the young growth. He didn't believe half of it, and he didn't stop her, was its own kind of belief. The town, which had been quiet out of curiosity, found its voice as soon as the rows showed green. Men at the Sage Creek Saloon took to calling her the foreign woman who played in the dirt, and the story went that Ezra Madden had gone soft and hired an outsider to grow vegetables on ground that wouldn't grow a weed. One of his hands, a man named Pruitt who'd been with the ranch 2 seasons, rode up to the porch and told Ezra he couldn't work a place that kept a foreign woman on it, and he quit there on the step and rode off with his wages in his pocket. Ezra stood on the porch and watched him go, and said nothing, because he couldn't think of a thing to say that wouldn't sound like a defense of a decision he hadn't admitted to making. Then the orchard answered. It happened on a morning in early summer, warm after a week of rain, when Ezra walked the rows out of habit and stopped at the 3rd tree, the one where she'd first tasted the dirt. A green shoot had pushed up through the cracked ground at the base of the dead trunk, pale and new and impossible. And then he saw another by the 5th tree, and another by the 8th. 3 years of nothing, and the ground had opened a leaf. He knelt there in his work clothes, and didn't move for a long time, and he didn't tell anyone, because telling someone would have made it a hope, and he wasn't yet ready to own a hope. The frost came 3 nights later, without warning, the kind that drops out of a clear sky and turns the valley white by dawn, and Ezra woke to a cold so sharp the water bucket had skinned over. He pulled his boots and went straight for the orchard, and the first thing he saw through the gray light was that she was already there. She'd lit smudge pots along the rows, little tin cans of manure, and damp leaves, burning low and smoky to hold a blanket of warm air over the ground, and she was moving down the rows, laying canvas sheets across the newest shoots by hand. Her hair was white with frost, and her lashes were rimmed in it, and she worked, the way she did everything, steady and without rush, as if the cold were a thing she'd agreed to. He found her at the 3rd tree at dawn, kneeling over the single shoot he hadn't told her about, her hands cupped around it under a square of canvas, the green leaf still alive in the dark between her palms. She looked up at him when his shadow fell across her, and her face was calm and tired and unsurprised, the face of a woman who'd been colder than this and lost more than a shoot and had kept going. Ezra Madden stood there with the frost on his hat and the dead orchard turning green around her knees, and he hadn't expected that, not any of it, not the leaf, and not the woman, and not the thing in his chest that he still wouldn't name. Hollis rode out on a Thursday with the deadline in his saddlebag and the manner of a man doing an unpleasant chore that he intended to finish on schedule. He wasn't a cruel man, Ezra had decided years ago. He was a careful one, which in a banker amounted to the same thing when your note came due. He tied his horse at the rail and walked the yard with his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes went to the orchard before they came to Ezra, because the orchard was the thing the whole valley was talking about, and the thing no one quite believed. 60 days was what I gave you, Hollis said, standing on the porch with his hat in his hand and his voice low enough that it carried the weight of a public announcement. That was 30 days back. You've got 30 left, and I'll be plain with you, Ezra, because the bank doesn't make its money from surprises. He paused and looked at the orchard again, the green rows visible over the fence, and his mouth thinned. I see your housekeeper has been busy. Ezra told him the orchard was coming back, and Hollis held up a hand the way someone holds up a hand to stop a door from closing on him. I don't take payment in gardens, Hollis said. I take cash, or I take a deed, and I've got a buyer out of Denver who'll give me cash for this place the day your name comes off it. Then he said the part that changed the shape of the trouble. He said the town wouldn't back a man who kept a foreign woman on his land, that the buyer had asked questions and the general store had answered them, and that a ranch with a reputation for the unusual was a ranch that sold for less. It was the first time the threat had turned toward her instead of toward the land, and Ezra felt it land differently than the banknote had. The loan was his problem, and he'd been carrying it alone, and he could carry it alone. But this was a man telling him to get rid of the woman who just spent a night in the frost saving his orchard, and Ezra found he couldn't carry that the same way. He stepped between Hollis and the yard. Not far, just enough, and he said it quiet, that she works my land, she answers to me. And the loan is between the two of us, and has nothing to do with who scrubs my floors. Hollis studied him a long moment, then put his hat on and gave him the date, the 30th, and rode out the way he'd come. After the dust settled, Sachi came around the corner of the cabin, with dirt to her elbows, and looked at him the way she looked at weather. Ezra told her what Hollis had said, the 30 days and the buyer and the warning about her, and he expected her to flinch, or to thank him for stepping in, and she did neither. "The trees will not fruit this season," she said, wiping her hands on her coat. "They need another year to bear, so we need something that pays before the trees do, or 30 days is 30 days. He'd spent 30 days fighting the bank on his own. And in one plain sentence, she'd told him his fight wasn't the one that was going to save the ranch, which left him standing in the yard with a new weight he hadn't been carrying before. If the trees wouldn't pay and the grass wouldn't pay, then the thing that saved the ranch was going to be something he hadn't thought of yet, and he wasn't sure he liked the idea that she might be the one who had. That night Ezra sat on the porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and the question he'd been avoiding since the platform in Sage Creek, and when she came out to shake the rug, he asked it. He asked her why she cared about land that wasn't hers, why she'd pour herself into ground she could be run off of in 30 days, and why a woman who'd crossed an ocean to scrub floors was kneeling in his dirt at dawn like the dirt was her own. He didn't expect her to answer, and he didn't expect the answer to be plain, and she gave him both. She sat down on the step, which was a thing he hadn't seen her do, and she talked the way she worked, a little at a time, with nothing wasted. Her grandmother's village had been in the hills near Kyoto, where the soil was thin and sandy, and would grow nothing unless it was fed, and where the families had fed it for 200 years, because they had nowhere else to go. Nothing left the farm, she said. Not the leaves in autumn. Not the ash from the hearth. Not the waste from the latrine. Not a scrap of cloth that couldn't be washed and worn again. The valley closed on itself and fed itself, year after year, on ground that a rancher here would have ridden past and called worthless, and it had fed the village since before anyone alive could remember. Ezra listened and didn't interrupt, because the way she said it made it sound less like a lesson and more like a map of a place she could still see. He asked her how she'd come to be here, on his porch in Colorado Territory, and her face didn't change, but her hands went still in her lap. She'd married a man in Yokohama who wanted to cross to America, and they'd taken a ship and then a wagon, and he'd taken a fever on the trail in Nebraska and died in a country he hadn't yet seen the good part of. She'd been alone since, working where work would have her, because the soil was the only thing she'd been taught to tend and the only thing that hadn't left her. The box, he said, the lacquered one. She told him it held the seed packets her grandmother had kept, the beans and the radish and the small onions, and a few tools with handles worn smooth by hands 3 generations back. It was the one thing she'd carried through the crossing and the wagon and the years after. She'd carried it because seeds were a kind of promise that outlasted the people who made them, and she brought it to his ranch because a dead orchard was a place that needed a promise whether it knew it or not. Something passed between them on that step that Ezra couldn't have explained to a man who hadn't been there, and he didn't try. It wasn't love, not even trust, but a recognition. 2 people who'd both learned what it cost to stand alone against ground that wanted to quit and had refused to let it. He'd spent his whole life hard on the dirt and easy on the leaving, and she'd spent hers easy on the dirt and hard on the leaving. And sitting there in the dark, he saw that those were the same stubbornness told in 2 directions. He didn't say any of it, because the kind of thing it was couldn't be said so much as shown, and the showing would come later when it cost him something to do it. The orchard filled in through the early summer the way a wound fills in slow and then all at once, and by midsummer the rows were thick enough that Ezra could stand at the fence and almost forget the trees had been dead. The beans had climbed the dead trunks, and the marigolds had bloomed between the rows, and the daikon had cracked the hard pan until the ground held water again, and the place looked like a different ranch than the one the bank was counting down on. It wasn't fruiting yet, and wouldn't for weeks. It was the one fact that kept the whole thing from being a victory, and Ezra carried that fact around with him like a stone in his boot. He woke one morning to a sound he knew in his bones before his eyes were open, the low sound of cattle moving where cattle weren't supposed to be, and he pulled his boots and went out with the rifle and the dawn coming up gray over the lower field. The fence on the south side had been cut clean with a wire tool, and 40 head had been turned in through the gap in the night. They'd walked the vegetable rows and the bean drills and the young growth at the base of the trees, and by the time he got there the lower half of the garden was trampled to stubble and mud. He found her, already in it. Sachi was kneeling at the edge of the ruin in the early light, gathering the broken shoots into her apron, not crying and not raging, just picking them up the way she picked up everything, one at a time, as if each one deserved the dignity of being collected. The calm of it was what turned Ezra's stomach, because he understood it for what it was. The calm of a woman who'd already survived worse than a trampled garden and had learned that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. He stood at the ruined fence with the rifle in his hand and the cut wire in the other, and for the first time in his life he wasn't angry at the land. He was angry at men, which was new, because he'd spent 40 years being hard on dirt and easy on the people who walked off it, and the trampling showed him how backwards that had been. He left her to the gathering and rode into Sachi Creek before the sun was full up, and he went straight to the saloon and found the man he expected to find. McCall ran the spread to the south, and he'd wanted the Mule Creek water rights since the year the creek ran low. McCall was leaning on the bar with a cup of coffee and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he asked Ezra how his foreign woman's garden was coming along, and the men around him went quiet. Ezra set the cut wire on the bar between them and said nothing about the garden. McCall looked at it and then at him and said the thing he'd come to say. A man who kept a foreign woman on his land and let her play farmer was a man the town had stopped taking seriously, and maybe the bank was doing him a favor. That was when Ezra said it. He said she was his, not his housekeeper and not his charity case, his. And he said it the way he said things, that were true, low and without room for a man to argue. The saloon went quiet, in the way a room goes quiet when something has been said that can't be taken back. And McCall's smile came off his face like a label off a bottle. Ezra rode home in the full morning with an enemy made and a promise spoken, and the knowledge that he hadn't yet told the woman it concerned what he'd just claimed her to be. The cut wire sat in his saddlebag, and the words sat in his chest, and both of them were going to have to be dealt with before the 30 days were up. A man who says a thing out loud in a saloon has said it to the whole territory, and he can no longer pretend he said it to himself. A week was what was left, when Ezra sat down at the kitchen table and told her he was going to ride in to the bank and sign the deed over. He'd pay her out of what little remained and send her to a town where a woman alone could find honest work. He said it the way he said hard things, flat and final, and he practiced it on the ride back from the south fence so it would come out without breaking. The orchard was recovering from the trampling, the rows coming back green, but it wouldn't fruit in a week, and it wouldn't fruit in 30 days, and the cash wasn't there and wasn't going to be there. And he decided in the night that he wouldn't drag her down with the place. Sachi set down the knife she'd been using and looked at him across the table, and she didn't do what he expected, which was to accept or to thank him or to cry. She refused him, told him she wouldn't be sent anywhere, that she'd been sent once already across an ocean and had arrived where she arrived, and that she wouldn't let him give up on ground she just brought back from the dead because his pride had run out of money. She said it without raising her voice, the way she said everything, and the calm of it was harder to argue with than anger would have been, because anger a man can shout down and calm he can't. The question that had been sitting under the whole story came up then and sat between them on the table. The land was his, had been his father's before him, and he was the one about to lose it. But she was the one who'd fed it back to life, and Ezra saw the thing he'd been refusing to see. She'd poured herself into ground that wasn't hers, kneeling in his dirt at dawn, and digging in his ash, and planting her grandmother's seeds in his dead orchard. And she'd done it without any promise that the ground would ever be hers to keep. The land belonged to the man who owned it, or it belonged to the woman who brought it back, and he didn't have an answer for that. And sitting across from her, he wasn't sure there was one. Then she showed him the thing he hadn't known about, and it changed the shape of the week. She went to the cabin and came back with a cloth purse and a sheaf of paper, and she laid them on the table beside his coffee. For weeks, she'd been taking seedlings and early produce to Harlan's general store in Sage Creek and to the cook at the mine camp up the creek, trading them for cash and for a written standing order for more. She'd been doing it quietly while Ezra was out fighting the bank on his pride. The purse held the cash she'd saved, and the sheaf held the cook's order, and together they weren't enough to clear the loan, but they were enough to change the conversation he'd been planning to lose. Ezra's pride broke that night, and it broke in the direction he needed it to break, which was the direction of admitting he couldn't do the thing alone. He'd spent his whole life treating help as a kind of debt he couldn't afford, and she'd spent hers treating waste as a kind of wealth he couldn't afford to throw away. And they were both stubborn in directions that had been ruining them until the night they pointed the same way. He told her they'd ride in together on the morning of the deadline, the cash and the order and the orchard in leaf, and they'd put it in front of Hollis and let the ground speak for itself. She nodded once, the way she did everything, with nothing wasted, and they sat at the table a long time after that without needing to say anything more, because the plan was made and the rest was up to the land and the banker and the morning. The morning of the 30th came up clear and warm, the kind of morning that makes a man forget the valley has ever been cruel, and Ezra loaded the wagon in the dark, while Sachi wrapped the seedlings in wet cloth. They put the cash purse and the mine camp's standing order in a tin box under the seat, and they put a crate of young plants in the bed, marigolds and bean starts and the small onions. They drove the 10 miles to Sage Creek with the sun at their backs and the orchard green behind them. Ezra had expected to feel the weight of the day on him, and instead he felt something lighter, because for the first time in 3 years he wasn't riding in to lose something alone. Hollis was waiting at the bank with the deed laid out, man from Denver sitting in the corner with his hat on his knee, and the whole arrangement had the look of a thing already finished. Ezra set the cash on the counter and the order, and he said the part he'd practiced, that the orchard was in full leaf and first blossom and standing as living collateral against the note, backed by the standing order from the mine camp and the trade at the general store. He told Hollis to ride out and look at it, because a man could call ground dead from behind a desk, but he couldn't call it dead standing in it. Hollis looked at the cash and the order, and then at the two of them, the rancher and the foreign woman who'd brought his land back, and he didn't answer right away. The town had shifted, while Ezra wasn't watching it shift. The preacher's wife had bought seedlings the week before and had told 3 other women, and Harlan had come around to vouch for the trade. Even Pruitt, the hand who'd quit rather than work a place that kept a foreigner, had been heard to admit that the ground at the Mule Creek was growing. Hollis read the room the way a banker reads a room, which is to say he counted the cost of being the man who took the deed on a ranch the whole valley was quietly rooting for. He counted the cost of the buyer from Denver, too, in a town that was no longer sure it wanted him. He told Ezra he'd ride out that afternoon, and he'd extend the note on the standing order and the orchard together, and the man from Denver folded his deed back into his coat and left without a word. Ezra and Sachi drove home in the late light with the note extended and the ranch still theirs and the orchard in blossom along the rows. And the most fertile ground in the territory was the ground everyone had called dead the spring before. The recognition between them was complete, and it had never needed to be spoken. She hadn't saved his land to own it, and he hadn't claimed her to keep it. The land had come back because two people who'd both been written off had decided to feed it instead of leaving. The orchard would fruit next season, and the question of what the two of them were to each other was still open, and the valley was quiet around them as they drove. The land came back, but who it belonged to was the question that stayed, and maybe the right question to sit with. Ground that's been starved and fed again doesn't belong to the man who held the deed, or the woman who held the seeds, so much as to the two of them together. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels.